Sheldon Cooper spent 30 years telling everyone his father was a cheating drunk who never understood him. There's only one problem. Young Sheldon proved that one of his most defining memories of his father never actually happened. And once that story falls apart, so does almost everything Sheldon ever told us about George Cooper. Today we're going back through both shows, Young Sheldon and The Big Bang Theory, and building the real picture of who George Cooper was. Not to turn him into a saint, because he wasn't one, but to ask a question nobody asks. What if the man Sheldon described to the world for 12 seasons was a version of his father that only existed inside a child's misunderstanding? And what did that misunderstanding cost George Cooper? I'm going to show you the evidence. You draw your own conclusions. Let's get into it. In The Big Bang Theory, George Cooper Sr. exists almost entirely as a ghost. He's dead before the first episode airs, and the only version of him we get comes through two sources: his wife Mary and his son Sheldon. And here's what makes that a problem. Neither of them is a neutral witness. Mary calls him a drunk. She tells people he was lazy, unmotivated, and ultimately unfaithful. Sheldon calls him simple-minded, a man who only cared about football and beer, a man who, according to Sheldon, caught him cheating at the age of 13, a trauma so deep it gave him his famous triple knock habit. For 12 seasons, we accepted all of this. And why wouldn't we? Sheldon has an IQ of 187 and an eidetic memory. If anyone has an accurate record of the past, it should be him. But here's what the research into memory and trauma actually tells us. High intelligence does not protect against emotional distortion. If anything, it makes it worse. A brilliant mind in pain will construct the most convincing, internally consistent narrative possible to explain that pain and then defend that narrative forever. That's not a character flaw, that's a human one. And young Sheldon, whether intentionally or not, spent 7 seasons quietly dismantling the narrative Sheldon built. Let's start with the foundational story, the cheating. In Season 7, Episode 4 of Young Sheldon, we finally get the answer to one of the franchise's longest-running questions. Young Sheldon comes home early. He hears something in his parents' bedroom. He opens the door. The woman wasn't a stranger. It was Mary, in a costume, trying to do something romantic for her husband. Now think about what that means. George Cooper never cheated. What Sheldon witnessed was a moment of intimacy between two married adults trying to keep a struggling marriage alive. And because nobody ever talked about it, because Sheldon was too young and embarrassed, because Mary never knew what her son believed he'd seen, that silence followed George into his grave. The triple knock habit, the cheating story, the foundation of how millions of people understood George Cooper's character, built on a misunderstanding that nobody ever corrected. And here's where the pattern begins. Because this is not the only time Sheldon misread his father. It's just the most dramatic example of something that happened over and over again throughout his childhood. George Cooper communicated in a language Sheldon simply could not process. In Big Bang Theory, Sheldon tells Leonard that he always wanted his dad to build rockets with him, that his father was never interested in science, never engaged with what mattered to his son. Young Sheldon shows us a different story. When Sheldon sent calculations to NASA and received no response, George didn't shrug and say, "That's too bad." He said, "We're going to Houston." He drove his son to the Space Center to deliver those calculations in person. He took his sons on a road trip to watch a shuttle launch. When the launch was rained out, George didn't end the trip. He sat with Sheldon in the rain and asked him to explain how lightning worked. And here's the thing, Sheldon himself admits, years later in the narration, "I didn't realize until years later that my father was only asking questions about lightning to cheer me up. He would often pretend to be dumb just to make me feel better." Sit with that for a second. The man Sheldon described as simple-minded was deliberately concealing his own intelligence so that his son could feel like the smartest person in the room. That's not a disinterested father. That's a father who learned to speak his son's language, even when his son never learned to speak his. Once you see this pattern, you notice it everywhere. When Sheldon fears flying, George doesn't dismiss the fear. He becomes Mr. Spock, so Sheldon has something familiar to hold on to. When Sheldon loses a science fair, George doesn't tell him the winner was better. He tells him what it means to shake hands and walk away with your head up. When Sheldon needs to give a speech, George doesn't write it for him. He shares a story about his own fear and tells his son that showing up every day Despite everything, that's what brave actually looks like. Over and over, George Cooper entered Sheldon's world, and Sheldon, for most of his life, never noticed. Now here's where it gets more complicated. Because to be fair to Sheldon and Mary, George was not a perfect man. He liked his beer. He got emotionally close to his neighbor Brenda Sparks, in a way that crossed lines even if nothing physical happened. He wasn't always emotionally available. There were nights he chose the couch and the television over his family. So let's hold both things at once. George had real flaws, and George also made a sacrifice that nobody in that family fully reckoned with. In Season 2, Episode 9, George receives a job offer from the University of Tulsa. Special teams coach, college level, significantly better pay. The kind of opportunity that had never come before and likely would never come again. From George's perspective, this was the first real door that had ever opened for him. From Mary's perspective, and it's worth understanding her position, moving to Oklahoma meant leaving her mother, her church community, her entire support system. Everything she had built her identity around was in Medford. Neither perspective is wrong, but watch what happens next. Mary doesn't discuss it as partners. She engineers the outcome she wants. She pulls Meemaw into it. She frames the dinner conversation so that George has no room to respond without looking selfish. And George, because he is George Cooper, turns it down. He tells the family he just didn't want to live in Oklahoma. But we know that's not true. We watch his face, we see what it costs him. The line that I keep coming back to comes much later. During an argument in Season 4, Mary says she didn't realize George was so unhappy. Because you never bothered to ask. 4 words. That's the whole George Cooper story compressed into 4 words. And here's what makes George genuinely complicated rather than simply sympathetic. When Georgie got Mandy pregnant and the church community began pulling away from the Cooper family, it was George who stood up. While Mary, a lifelong member of that church, hesitated, George walked in and told a room full of people exactly what he thought of their version of Christian community. And then he said, "I'll be in the truck." No sermon, no speech, just action. That's who George Cooper was when it counted. Not a saint, not a villain. A man who showed up for his family in the ways he knew how, and paid a quiet, lifelong price for the ways he fell short. George Cooper died on a May morning in 1994. He went to work. He said, "See y'all later." He had a heart attack at his desk. And that was it. No warning, no goodbye, no resolution, no final conversation where he found out what Sheldon believed he'd seen in that bedroom. No moment where Sheldon called from California and said, "Dad, I think I've been misreading you my whole life." Just the door, and then nothing. And what happened after his death? This is where interpretation becomes important, because none of us can know what Mary was thinking. But what we observe is this. The George Cooper who appears in Big Bang Theory is a significantly harsher version of the man we spent 7 seasons watching in young Sheldon. Whether that shift happened because of grief, because of guilt over unresolved things between them, or simply because memory is imperfect, the effect is the same. The real George, the man who drove to Houston, who became Mr. Spock, who walked out of a church for his son, that George largely disappeared from the record. And Sheldon, who absorbed the version of his father that the family repeated, carried that version into adulthood and broadcast it to the world for 12 seasons. George Cooper never got to correct it. Here's what I think the George Cooper story is actually about. It's not about a bad husband or a good father or a wasted life in Medford, Texas. It's about a specific kind of person that most of us either know or are. The person who absorbs what everyone else needs. Who makes the decision that keeps the family together, even when it costs them personally. Who shows love in ways that are practical and quiet, and completely invisible to the people receiving it. George's deepest wound was not the Tulsa job or Mary's emotional connection with Pastor Rob, or even the way his own son described him to strangers in California. George's deepest wound was simpler than all of that. Nobody ever asked what he wanted. Not Mary. Not Sheldon, not Georgie, not Missy. They all needed things from him, and he gave what he could. But in 14 years of marriage and fatherhood, the question, "What do you actually want, George?" apparently almost never got asked. And when it finally did, he said, "Because you never bothered to ask." Which means he'd been waiting to answer it for a very long time. In his Nobel Prize speech, Sheldon says his father taught him that the only kind of smart that really matters is the kind that makes you a good man. After 30 years of calling his father simple-minded, Sheldon got him exactly right in one sentence. Which tells me that somewhere, underneath everything, Sheldon always knew who George Cooper was. He just never said it while George was alive to hear it. And here's what I keep circling back to. The thing that started this whole video. Sheldon's 3-knock habit. The thing he's done for 30 years. The ritual that began the night he opened a bedroom door and believed he'd seen his father betray his mother. Every single knock, for 30 years, was a monument to a lie. Not a lie George told, a lie the silence created. Maybe the saddest part of the George Cooper story isn't that Sheldon misunderstood his father. It's that George died before Sheldon ever learned the truth. Do you think the real George Cooper would have wanted Sheldon to know the truth about that bedroom? Or do you think he would have let it go, the same way he let everything else go? Tell me in the comments below. If this investigation changed how you see George Cooper, there are 2 more characters on this channel, with stories that are just as buried and honestly, even more devastating once you see the full picture. Go find them. And if you want to be here for every breakdown, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.